So I've mentioned a few of these things, I think, in the recurring themes and things that I saw come up a lot. So when I think about what we're doing well, I definitely think the whole meshing together of development and security is on a really positive trajectory. This notion of hiring security people with engineering skills that I mentioned before, I think is valuable. The emphasis on empathy, and even more, and I want to emphasize this notion of development being willing to take security on.
Hi, you're listening to The Secure Developer. It's part of the DevSec community, a platform for developers, operators, and security people to share their views and practices on DevSecOps, Dev and Sec collaboration, cloud security, and more. Check out devsecon.com to join the community and find other great resources. This podcast is sponsored by Snyk. Snyk's developer security platform helps developers build secure applications without slowing down, fixing vulnerabilities in code, open source, containers, and infrastructure as code. To learn more, visit snyk.io/TSD. That's SNYK.io/TSD. On today's episode, Guy Podjarny, founder of Snyk, is joined once again by colleague and field CTO Simon Maple. Simon takes the role of host in this episode and chats to Guy about key 2021 podcast themes. Topics include hiring people with development experience into security teams and how empathy both ways makes a huge difference to collaboration, as well as the need to adapt security education to be more accessible to developers. They discuss the growth of DevSecOps activities in government departments and some of the latest observations around how cloud security work is being handled by different teams today. Looking forward to 2022, some of the key topics to discuss include supply chain security, measuring security, which is still an unsolved problem, and the future into cloud security as we see the dynamics changing in the organization. We'd also like to go deeper into the more highly regulated industries, including potential regulation changes and how they might affect us. Scaling DevSecOps across large organizations is another interesting topic, as well as continuing to do more in diversifying the community. We hope you enjoy that conversation, and don't forget to leave us a review on iTunes if you enjoyed today's episode.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Secure Developer Podcast. This is a year-end episode. We're going to look back on 2021. My voice you may recognize as the year-end episode recorder. I'm here with a more familiar voice, Guy Po. Guy, how's it going?
It's going well. Thanks, Simon. Thanks for teeing this one up.
Absolutely, yeah. So why don't we do some intros? So I'm Simon Maple, Field TTO here at Snyk, and joining me, the man Guy Po, Guy Podjarny. So Guy, why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself, in case anyone doesn't recognize your voice?
It's funny, every now and then you sort of think about the fact that you don't want to take it for granted that people, know what you're up to. So if you happen to not know, I am the founder and president at Snyk, and really president is not an overly descriptive title. In practice, I try to think about what's ahead and help steer us a little bit in some of the strategy and kind of next directions at Snyk as we grow, which has been a fairly steep growth curve over the course of really like a bunch of years, but definitely this last year as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And for those of you not familiar with the year-end formats, this is where I ask Guy a number of questions looking back on the episodes that were recorded and showed in 2021. During the year, we did 22 episodes with 23 guests, so a great number of people, of experts in different various companies and organizations that we were able to speak to. So Guy, let's jump straight in. And really, first of all, this is a similar question that I asked last time, and it'll be interesting to see if the answer has changed here. We're really looking at some of the recurring themes, the recurring messages that people were talking about during the episodes across 2021. What were they, and how did they differ from the previous year?
It's a good question. And, I find one of the things I like about the sort of end of year episode is that it allows me to go back and re-listen to some of the episodes from the beginning, or sort of look at them, be, again, reminded of some of the great insights that we got from folks. And it does feel, between pandemic and sort of Snyk space, like an era, like an old, many years ago in a galaxy far, far away, when you just sort of go back to January or February. I think the messages were really, a lot of them were along sort of similar lines as in 2020, but a little bit less pandemic shock and more, just sort of reality, and a little bit more maturity, a little bit more about sort of the next stage. I think if I try to sort of summarize them a little bit, probably the top theme that was very consistent and evolved from the year before, where it was more of a novelty, was the notion of hiring developers into your security team, or hiring people with software engineering skills. Really heard a lot of that over the course of this year. I guess Rohit at Yext very recently, Rinky, Twitter CISO, Dev from security at Figma, really many others stated that they would prefer to hire engineering skills over security skills if they had to choose. In general, we're aligned that it is, on one hand, they feel like it's easier to teach engineers security than to teach security people engineering, but also because they feel like that gives them better empathy and kind of better ability to interact with the engineering teams. That was definitely something that was more of a thought in 2020 and really became, I think, increasingly the norm, at least amidst my somewhat selection biased influenced guests over here, which I guess relates to a second and a very similar or related theme, which was this need for security to adapt to development. I think we generally, especially when I think back to the beginning of Snyk 6 years ago, or the beginning of this podcast a year or two later, a lot of the concern was around security people trying to force their practices, getting developers to do as security does. And I think the realization came out loud and clear this year that people are looking to do the other way around. They're saying, okay, let's see what development is doing and think about how do we adapt our security practices to still be secure, to still weave security in, but adapt it to development. You heard a lot of different versions of this. Amanda at Cisco talked a lot about empathy and really kind of dug into how it's important and how you can build it up. Nick at Pearson really emphasized it as well, talked about how aligning to the engineering teams there and to their practices is very key. Dev at Figma, he really went as far as saying that I loved that sort of phrase, that when he goes and asks for a developer to do something, I need you to handle this aspect of security, he goes as far as starting with an apology saying, hey, I'm sorry, I'm going to need to have you to, there's this security need. I haven't figured out how to spare you the need to do it yet. So I'm going to need to ask you to make sure that you, whatever, sanitize inputs or whatever it is that concern. For some people, that feels almost a bit extreme, but I liked how it just sort of embodied the concepts. And in general, Dev had a lot of great tips about, bonding between dev and security, especially in this sort of remote working surrounding through working together on incidents and other collaborations. So I felt like those two were probably at the top. Does that make sense?
Yeah, no, absolutely. No, I actually think, they really actually go in hand, because I feel like hiring developers into your security team, actually, first of all, with the talent shortage that has been very widely reported around people struggling to find people with security aspirations to join their team, having a larger pool to hire from, particularly in developers, really goes a long way to, I would say, helping the hiring groups there. But I would also say, the empathy, it's one thing to try and teach empathy in the sense of teaching security folks, you need to be able to understand what the development teams are going through, their perspective, etc. But it's one of those things that's just built in when you hire a developer, right? Because it's just a developer, someone with development experience talking to someone with development experience, and you don't actually need to train something like that. It's more something that is just built in and understood from the security team then. So I think that's a really valuable thing, which is very useful from the engagements there. Yeah,
I agree. And I think sadly, the scarcity of developers is starting to kind of get right up there with the scarcity of security people, but it's still probably like you've got a better shot at hiring that way. I think the counter or the other theme that I saw was on the flip side. And I have, this is definitely a little bit of a selection bias, but it's not so much the counter, but rather complementary side of it, is that this year at the beginning of the year especially, but really throughout the year, managed to get a bunch of guests that are working on developer tools and came to talk about security. It was partially intentional, but it was also the result of just a lot of interest and activity that happens within the dev tooling world, when it comes to embedding security in. And I think that's the other thing that really changed this year, this acknowledgement by dev tools and the development sort of ecosystem and community that security isn't a thing that's off to the side, but rather that every developer tool has some amount of responsibility to build security into their workflows. And so you had Justin Cormack, who's Docker's CTO, talk about helping developers be secure by default, and do we run or do we fail Docker builds and scans at the beginning, and their addition of Docker scan to flag those. We had James Turnbull talk about DevOps type metrics like service level objectives or SLOs and others, and how do you apply them to security and how to think about security observability. So really saying, okay, how do we take the DevOps practice and apply it to security? And there was this super insightful episode with Liz Rice, and she was describing eBPF, which is a great kind of underpinning technology that's coming around in the DevOps world, but talked about how we can level up security. So I think it's working on both sides, which I guess has to happen for success. Security is adapting to development practices, but development tools and development leaders are really kind of embracing security and thinking about security responsibility. If I veer a little bit off the people route, I guess not too far off, and I think about tech, there was definitely a lot more mention of security education in this year's episodes and guests. There were actually like 3 episodes that were almost entirely about it. We had Shua from UHG, United Health Group, describe how they do practices, sort of education practices. Actually, this super cool and fun way to do it. If you haven't listened to the episode, it describes these quests for security education, things like that. Very recommended to listen to it. Jet from Nike talked about how we had to adapt their security education practice from classrooms to the remote work. And they did things like an internal podcast where we brought external guests to it, and which sounded super, super useful. And we had David Wheeler from the Open Source Security Foundation, the OpenSSF, or in general, he works at the Linux Foundation, talk about kind of an ecosystem education. How do we bring that into schools and into software development practices? So there's a lot of emphasis that came around this. Only one of those 3 episodes was actually teed up to be about education. So a lot of them, it was just about the impetus of it, but also lots and lots of mentions about the importance of security education and equipping developers in the right fashion with the information they need all the way through the ecosystem, which was super interesting.
Yeah, and I think that awareness among development teams around the importance of security and how to do secure development well is something which is just becoming, a greater and greater thing that organizations want. But it's still one of those things, without that empathy, it's very, very hard to do well. Like a lot of security programs and fairly broad programs that are given to organizations or development teams, they're very often just way off in terms of the relevance, in terms of what the development team actually want, and actually just becomes an overhead. So it's a big challenge, right, in terms of getting the development teams the style knowledge that they actually want for it to actually be useful to them and for them to want to listen to that education.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's about caring that they actually learn from the process. So not just thinking, hey, I have this checkbox that I have to check around giving developers security education. I'll do something. It doesn't really matter if it's effective or loved or not. It just, satisfies the compliance requirement versus actually engaging and saying, well, how do I invest creativity and time and resources in finding the right way to have them truly understand, truly learn, truly embed? And there's still definitely a gap around being able to measure the impact of that. That's definitely still a gap, but the importance of it has clearly gone up, and it's been mentioned by many guests. Yeah, and I guess the last recurring theme, I'd say, doesn't really point to one episode or the other, but more overall, is this notion of sort of security hygiene at scale. You talk to people about what worries them, to the guests, about what worries them, talk about where their emphasis are, what their priorities are. And a lot of them are just about being able to lock your doors and your windows at scale, at the pace that we are working at today for, in modern development and in cloud development. And so it wasn't really about some fancy nation state managing to break down your door. It was much more indeed just about getting the basics right. And we've also we've seen examples of that. We've seen all sorts of breaches this year. Supply chain security is probably a topic of its own. We should probably get back to that a little bit. I think that's going to grow in this coming year, but we've seen various attacks there. And, we're sort of finishing the year with the massive sort of Log4j vulnerability, right, called Log4Shell, which is really, it's all about how quickly are you able to respond to a severe vulnerability in a component that you're using? Do you know where you are using it? Are you able to quickly roll out a fix? And those are basics. They're not fancy capabilities, but being able to do them at scale and at speed is very hard. And I'd say almost all of the programs and drives that have been mentioned and prioritized by the guests this year have been focused on that concept of getting the core done right at scale and at speed.
Yeah, and I think it actually lends itself to other topics that you've mentioned already, with the concepts of building security into dev tools, with the concepts of security education and awareness among development teams as to how that security hygiene actually grows in an organization. And I think mentioning Log4j, the Log4Shell exploits and attacks that are happening now, it's very interesting to see the differences on Twitter, or rather the different experiences different developers are having on Twitter based on how their security hygiene is. Some are like, headless, trying to understand what this even means to them, where issues exist. Others that already have good tooling, good education, are much calmer about it, understanding straight away where issues exist. And more often than not, it's kind of like business as usual approach in order to fix those, rather than experiencing these kind of attacks and these kind of vulnerabilities for the first time. It's very interesting to see those differences.
Yeah, for sure. And I think it's I kind of try my best here not to make this a commercial sort of Snyk episode, but if I look at some Snyk data, what we've seen at Snyk is we've seen this big surge of people adding projects to them. So I think what it also has done is, specifically the Log4Shell breaches, or not breach, but vulnerability, is that it added some urgency. Even people that were on a good path, it reminded them that you need to have visibility for all of your projects. You can't just gradually shift it, which is one of the key differences between developer and security. I think dev tools, they're local. You build an application. If it's using amazing technology, to build it, then it will be loved, and that technology will get adopted elsewhere. While security, there's a certain need for breadth. There's a certain need for coverage. So we're seeing that. But either way, I think that theme, that need for security hygiene and building that into the practices, is also encouraging, because it means you don't need developers to be super fancy, blockers and know kung fu to be able to block the attackers. They just need to know how to do the basics and need to think about that and make it day to day. So that was definitely an overarching theme.
Yeah, absolutely. And as you mentioned, at the time of recording, this is news coming as we day by day as things happen. So it'll be interesting to see how this plays out over the coming days and weeks. So going back to the podcast over 2021, one of the wonderful things about the podcast is you get some amazing guests from lots of different organizations that are really pushing the way security is done and showing others how it can be done through their best practices, etc. Personally, what are some of the most important things that you've learned from some of the guests that we've had over the previous year?
I learned a ton. I'm so spoiled with this this podcast. I get the opportunity to reach out to smart people and then bring them on to the show and ask them the questions that I find interesting. And
there's a question in itself, Guy. Did you do it to teach others, or did you do it just selfishly because you wanted to talk to these amazing people?
I like to think it serves both purposes, but I definitely learn a lot from them. I don't think there's an episode that I came out of that I didn't feel like I learned some great perspective. Sometimes it's a perspective, sometimes it's a phrasing, sometimes it's a technique, sometimes it's a brand new topic. That also happens. So I definitely learned a ton. The top one that jumps to mind is the CodeCov episode, mostly because it was just a unique experience. So if you haven't listened to it, we had the CodeCov founders come on the show, Jared and Eli, CEO and CTO of the companies, or the leaders of it. And they described the experience and the whole set of steps that happened as part of the CodeCov breach, which was one of the more sort of serious and more publicized supply chain attacks and breaches that happened this year. And so I thought it was super insightful because they just let us into the feeling of what it was in the moment when you suddenly find out that this grave things happened and you need to deal with it. How do you know what to do? How do you kind of overcome the maybe overwhelming sense at the time of gravity, of how severe this is? How do you keep thinking about your users versus thinking about covering yourself in the process? So generally, I'm super grateful for them for coming onto the show, and I found it super insightful. And I think it is a very valuable episode to listen to. If nothing else, it would equip you a little bit better if you unfortunately find yourself in a situation like it. So that was the top one that jumps to mind. And I guess similarly isolated or contained was from a technology learning perspective was the episode with Liz Rice on eBPF, which frankly is just fascinating technology. So I guess you can think of it as something as impactful as containers into the network. And so eBPF is something you should learn about. And, Liz definitely educated me and hopefully all the listeners about it at the time. So that was very useful. I guess a bit more in sort of summary learnings. So things that I've just sort of seen repeatedly emphasized and have, grown to appreciate and build my understanding of. There are other topics. So definitely saw how much governments are adopting DevSecOps as well. And how some of the parallels when we think about empowered teams and such work there. So I had two primary guests from government organizations come in. I had Robert Wood, or Rob, who works at the CMS, which deals with the healthcare services in the US. And I had Nicholas Chailan, who was the chief software officer at the US Air Force. And so both of them really talked about how they work with these other groups that are very independent. And that actually brings to fore all sorts of DevOps related practices, because you have to work in a platform mindset. And each of them had a little bit of a different flavor of risk aversion that they had to deal with. For Rob, it was more around accountability. It's more about getting the different groups within CMS to not just think about hey, I'm going to do the minimum and deliver the software, but rather take on the responsibility for securing what they're building and equip them with sort of the right measures and sort of approaches to make them successful at it. And so some groups were more empowered than others, which is very similar. It's like at the group level, but it's very similar to working with developers. For Nicholas, a lot of the challenge that he spoke about the most was probably more around demonstrating impact. So this is not a surrounding in which you have commercial success. It's more about project success. So what are the measures? What are the metrics that you measure the success of a DevOps or DevSecOps program? Because he was pushing DevOps and agility as well. What are the measures there that actually would mobilize people to action? So he talked about productivity metrics and efficiency, which are measures that those organizations measure themselves on. So it was really interesting, because governments I still think that they're not at the forefront for the most part in terms of DevSecOps, but it was interesting to see how the same principles do come to fore.
And is that largely because of things like regulations and compliance and things like that? Or do you feel like there's another reason as to why they're sometimes a little bit later in adopting some of these newer principles?
Yeah, I think there's a whole set of reasons. But I think if you look at the problems that are being measured, one, for example, is the upside is less clear than the downside. When you think about a business success, if you're doing the right thing, if the business runs fast, then you are financially successful, you sell more. In a government, if you ran fast and all that, you need to get satisfied by the projects and their individual impacts. There isn't that overall metric typically, while the downside, if you don't deliver it, actually has a lot of noise and a lot of attention being put onto it. And so that's one aspect of it. And the other is I think just at the individual level, recognition and understanding of, I think a lot of the people working in those organizations, the governments, are actually very mission driven, but being able to relate their individual accomplishments to actually driving this type of change. And yeah, I mean, risk tolerance, shall we say those surroundings are not well known for risk tolerance. I think when you talk about the Air Force or the DoD, there's also the additional concern of the fact that they deal with extremely sensitive topics, which again reduces or creates more risk aversion. So I think those are like the key themes. If I mention a few sort of quick ones that also kind of repeated through it. I find I evolved my view around what is the right location for a CISO in the organization. I think I started the year thinking that really we should be moving CISOs to report into the engineering organization. And I think through the year, there have been many countermentions as well. Jeff Belknap talked about his own change when he was on the show before as a CISO at Slack. He talked about how it was very impactful to having them moved to the CISO organization. Now that he's at LinkedIn and he came on the show again, he says he thinks that it's really much more about wherever you are, what's important is your boss's interest in security and influence in the organization, but otherwise it's not that significant. Rohit talked about how, because he was at Collective Health and now he's at Yext, how the right place was different in the two of them. Dev from Figma talked about Dropbox and his experience over there versus his work now at Figma, and how different practices or different organizational structures were correct. He had actually a different emphasis even before I talked about Jeff's comment. Dev's view was that the key thing is to ensure that your highest performers are working on the most important problem. He was more talking about less where the org is and more how do you structure your own org, which was really, really good. So I think those are very important, and for me was an evolution of my thinking. What I have seen, and I don't know if this is a learning as much as just reaffirmation, is that the lines are blurring between cloud security, AppSec, security engineering. You really saw this all over the place. Nobody has a clear-cut line where that is. Sometimes you see security responsibility in different teams within it. So those three areas of AppSec, CloudSec, and security engineering, and even product security, as in building security features, they blur all the time. Ashish from PageUp talked about CloudSec and AppSec mixing up. DJ from VillageMD doesn't even have a security title as he did previously, but he still owns security, but he owns security and DevOps. A lot of things are really blurring over there. So I think organizational fluidity is higher. And for me, I learned to appreciate where you are in the org and exactly how you structure it is maybe less important than what I thought at the beginning of the year, as long as you have the right emphasis and that you're focused on the right way to engage with the rest of the org.
And I think there's a lot we can learn there, which I think high level concepts in a way, how teams are structured, how organizations work together. In terms of if individual groups wanted to make changes and actually do it themselves without needing to restructure an org or anything like that, what were some of the takeaways and learnings, maybe concrete tips or methodologies that you thought people can actually take away from an episode and implement in their own organization quickly?
I love the tips. I love when someone comes on the show and says, well, this is how I've done it. I try to remember to try and tease it out of them, because they surely have some. There were many that I liked this year. I mentioned it before. So Shua's approach to gamification around security education was really cool. It's a model in which it's almost like a role-playing game for security education, where you actually have levels and you take on quests. And it sounded really, really fun and very much worth considering. I guess a couple from recent episodes. So Rohit mentioned, I put him on the spot a bit to say, what's your favorite hiring question, interview question, allowed us then to share in his question, which is he asks people to threat model a topic, which I love because it's such an open-ended question where you can see where do people take it. You ask them to threat model some problem, some scenario. And you see where they take it, where do they put the emphasis. And so I really like that. I guess similarly from a very recent episode is Tim Crowther's distinction between controls and guardrails. Could have put that in the learnings really, but he kind of used the two terms, and he basically highlighted how controls are more about thou shalt not pass, and they're more around limiting and the terminology around control is, I'm going to constrain you. I'm not going to allow you to do something. While guardrails, they convey a positive statement. They're saying, I'm helping you. And guardrails, they sound more supportive, than controls. And so I thought that was really good. I keep coming back to the episode with Dev just because he had a lot of these great sound bites in his episode. So he when we talked about working or creating bonds between teams, in a remote working surrounding between the development team and the security team, he really emphasized how working on incidents together, not just security incidents, even just uptime incidents, really kind of made people gel and work well together. So that was really interesting and brought up the notion of, should AppSec teams actually be part of the on-call rotation, working, especially when you have multiple people on an on-call rotation, just to work together and you create these bonds, which was a great tip for, especially for remote work surrounding. And yeah, and I guess the last one I'll mention is Ashish from PageUp had this really great, sneaky but fun way to uncover which developers care about security, where I think early, maybe even one of the first things he did when he joined PageUp was to run this internal capture the flag competition, optional. People could opt in to join a capture the flag competition, and that flushed out the developers that cared about security, just sort of naturally, by virtue of who came in to join in, and so that kind of gave him this set of allies to work with, which I really liked. Nitzan Bluin from Spotify, she was on the show last year, and she had a similar, when she was building up her AppSec program, she surveyed everybody to get their feedbacks about what they think was interesting or not, and part of the advantage of her surveying the different people was to see who brings up who is engaged, right? Who provides a lot of opinions, and those were her allies to come in. So both of those I thought were really, really nice tips. So anyways, lots and lots of tips. You're going to have to listen to a lot of those, but those are probably my the top ones that come to mind.
Yeah, absolutely. And I really love the capture the flag style, way of also educating and creating great awareness among development teams around security and the way exploits can happen and things like that. So it's another great way of really raising that awareness.
Yeah, and I think it's worth, if you're not aware of it and you're listening to it, raising the capture the flag competition is actually not as hard as you think. Today there are all sorts of platforms and things like that you can do it. So don't be deterred by it, or don't be too frightened of it. If you're trying to run one of those to sort of see who in the team is engaged in security, you can get one up reasonably easily.
So Guy, we're coming up to the end of the year, and as is normal for organizations, a lot of the time people do performance reviews, right? So, Guy, we're going to do a live performance review for you on the no, we're not going to do that. But let's do a performance review almost for dev teams. What are they? The two questions, of course, that we would typically ask is, what are dev teams currently doing well, and how's that been shown this year? And also, what are dev teams still needing to improve?
Yeah, and that's a hard thing, right? Because nothing is black and white, really. We're improving in some fronts, not. So I've mentioned a few of these things, I think, in the recurring themes and things that I saw come up a lot. So when I think about what we're doing well, I definitely think the whole meshing together of development and security is on a really positive trajectory. This notion of hiring security people with engineering skills that I mentioned before, I think is valuable. The emphasis on empathy, and even more, and I want to emphasize this notion of development being willing to take security on. And Simon, I think even in the episode where you shared some of these sort of state of cloud native AppSec reports with us, there was some hard data that shows the developers are engaged in security. And you can correct me if I'm misquoting here, but what I really liked was you were mentioning how twice as many, in terms of ratios, developers thought that developers should own security versus security people. So basically, security people are more reluctant to let go, maybe, or need to be more willing to let go because developers are actually more ready to embrace it. So I think that's a great improvement. And similarly, the dev tooling ecosystem that emphasize it. And I think, clearly, this podcast is a great learning vehicle for me, but through Sneak and just working in the industry, you see this well past all of those. You see them well past the podcast guests, as you see these themes. So I really do think that the dam has sort of been broken. This notion of developers don't care about security, developers will never pick up security. I think we're past that, or we're pretty much well on our way to be past that, and it's more of a how. So that's I'd say the primary thing that's going well, but it's the most important thing because things derive out of that.
Yeah, and I always, when I hear people say developers don't care about security, it always bugs me that, because you talk to developers, and developers do care about their applications. Of course, you'll get extremes where some developers just don't care about it. They're doing a 9 to 5. They're there for the paycheck. In my opinion, devs are, they are proud about what they create. And they do have pride in their work and pride in their professionalism. So when I hear developers not wanting to take security on, it's typically for other reasons rather than a developer not wanting their application or not caring about their application being secure. It's typically other barriers that exist in the way. Perhaps, the existing tooling that they're using isn't friendly. Perhaps they don't have the right education to understand what, the necessary fixes. So yeah, I absolutely agree that the dam has been broken, and that developers are not just acknowledging that they want to take security on, but want to work with the security teams more and more. And certainly over this year, I've never seen developers more engaged in these kind of activities and just engaged in general with security organizations in the past.
Yeah, absolutely. I think this almost inevitably leads to the second part where I do think we need to improve, which is the implementation of it. And I'd say the two primary gaps are measurement and clarity. So measurement, I keep asking this question, especially when I feel like I got sharp answers, from a guest, asking, okay, how do you measure security? And nobody really says, oh, I've got this nailed. I know precisely how to do it. There's actually a really cool episode coming shortly at the beginning of the year with Garrett Held from Carta, which I would suggest you tune in, who has a really, really interesting measuring risk type approach. But either way, it's a challenge still. So we need, when you think about the DevOps industry, we've standardized on these sort of SLOs and SLAs and SLIs and practice around them and understanding of uptime. So we just need to level up over there. We've seen some tips and tricks around it. Dev, again, from Figma, had this notion of having pairing metrics, that one goes up, one goes down, like how many bug bounty reports. You want to get more bug bounty reports, but then you want to measure that against the percentage of valid reports, right? Where you want to make sure that they're balanced against one another. Amanda at Cisco took more, she was heavy on the empathy and stakeholder mentality. And so she took more of a qualitative approach where she surveys her stakeholders to say, hey, are we doing well? How do you think we've improved, and measures that over time? And kind of Daniel Bryant and James Turnbull, who are both coming from DevOps world more than security, took more of an ELTs, like accessibility, observability, testability type comment, and talks about that, which reminds me of Shannon Leitz's episode a year prior talking about securability. So there are progress, there are thoughts in this space, but I think we need to crack measurement and understand whether we're doing better or worse. And related to that is, I think there's lack of clarity around the split between security and dev. And at this point, it's less confrontational and more setting up collaboration. And I think the security world is evolving to resemble more, how ops has evolved and become more of a platform to help developers succeed. But I think in ops, we have a better handle today on where those lines are. There's also a gray area. And I think we need to level up over there in security to just understand what is it that we expect security teams to provide, and what is it that we expect developers to provide, and what is in the middle, which is legit. There's going to be some in the middle, and how are we going to tackle that on? So I think those practices are what we'll see evolving.
Yeah, very, very interesting. So I think, those going into 2022, I think those are going to be interesting ones that we'll see improvement around. What other security challenges do you feel our guests, I guess, that are going to be talking to you around what they're going to experience in 2022 in their organizations?
So measure security is one. I mean, I think I I just spoke to it, so I'm not sure there's a ton more that I will apply to it. But fundamentally, as we decentralize security, we need better taxonomy, better tools to be able to collectively know whether we are doing well or poorly, whether we are improving or worsening. And so I think this measurement element is improvement. And fundamentally, we need to take it up a notch as well. It's not just the measurement of your SLAs for fixing known vulnerabilities. It's around relating code activity to risk. Fundamentally, security teams should be working in risk measures about how do I protect the organization, but you want to relate that to the technical work. And so I think that's going to be a challenge that's going to come up a lot this year, and even sometimes going as far as business impact. When you think again about DevOps and how we've evolved that area, it went from measurement of uptime to measurement of business success due to agility. And so I think measurement is definitely there. The next one, which might be the first one, frankly, in terms of importance, is supply chain security. Look, this year, we actually, except for the CodeCov episode, we haven't talked about that as much in the podcast. We've had the CodeCov episode, we've had Nicholas from the Air Force talk about dependencies of dependencies and how everything is over there. But as an industry, this has definitely been the year that surfaced the concerns and the woes of supply chain security. The fact that we are dependent on one another. SolarWinds is probably the biggest example of that. CodeCov next to it. Now, even Log4Shell is an example of it, which is we're building towers and we're building on the shoulders of giants and communities and other in the community. And we created this web of dependencies between services, between components, between individuals, and we have to get a handle of that. And so there's a lot of work going on there right now. There was the executive order from Biden driving a lot of activity because federal agencies and the government will be requiring more sort of software bill of materials with SBOM reports and SBOM quality for any software that they purchase. We see the OpenSSF. I'm on the board of the Open Source Security Foundation. I think is a premier member there. And there's great collaboration between all sorts of companies working together to help us, because this is very much something where we need to come together as a community to define what are the standards with which we define what good looks like, and how do we communicate in ways that different tools, because this is, there's no single solution that would solve supply chain security end to end. So how do we collaborate well? And there's a lot of emphasis over here. I do suspect we're going to see some breaches or some additional sort of big scale vulnerabilities. I'm sure those will continue, but I think this year you'll see a lot of security programs that need to tackle this. So I'm going to try and help all of us learn by trying to get guests to share those. And we'll definitely touch on that. And I guess the third one I'd say is cloud security. I mentioned this around the blurring lines, but it's tricky. When you come into it, most companies take on cloud security as an evolution of IT security. They think about their VMs in the data center, how they move to the cloud, and how they're securing them that way. So they are organizationally set up that way. They are culturally thinking about it this way, like tools, they're equipped to tackle that way. Increasingly, there's kind of clear acknowledgement that cloud is software. Cloud is sort of turning IT into software, and it requires software security related tools. And I think that's rocking the boat. And people need to figure out how to tackle it, how to think about cloud security in infrastructure as code terms, how to think about container security as an evolution of the app, not the VM. And so I'll see a lot of that is already happening already, like more and more of the guests, although they originally came from AppSec, are dealing with those types of concerns. And I think we'll see a lot more of that this coming year.
Yeah, which is interesting. That it also goes to some of the blurred lines that you're mentioning about how teams organize themselves as well, which is a part of that, I guess, as well. So going into 2022, then guests and topics that you want to talk about. What is on your kind of like hit list for getting different individuals into the podcast?
Yeah. I wanted to learn about so many things on it. So look, the ones that I mentioned right now are the things that I think we should as a community learn about. So supply chain security, cloud security measurement. So I'm going to do my best to bring guests that have opinions and perspectives on those areas. Personally, I'm really interested in the potential regulation changes that might happen. So in my kind of question about, what do you think would change the most in the next 5 years, two guests, Jeff Belknap from LinkedIn and Tim Crothers from Mandiant, have both mentioned regulations. Jeff talked about how, when you think about the generally accepted accounting principles, the GAAP practices that CFOs are subject to today, those did not exist, I think, before Enron and the corruptions and sort of similar type corruption elements there. And that drove the CFO regulations. And he expects, and I think that's really interesting, that the same will happen to security regulations as well. And so that we'll see with the amount of breaches, we'll see companies being, and even public markets expecting sort of security practices to be communicated and standardized. Team had a maybe more pessimistic approach. It's like, look, fundamentally, we're kind of failing as an industry. We're like every year we're spending more money and getting more breaches in the security space. So again, sort of things, regulators are not just going to allow that to continue as is. They're going to demand companies, regulators and public markets kind of sharing the same view. So I find that really interesting. So I'm going to seek out, and if people are listening to this and have thoughts to share on the space, I'd love to hear those. I think that's interesting. I definitely want to talk about DevSecOps at large scale. So when we think about the community maturing, we're also seeing large banks, we're seeing large governments, as we spoke before, talk about successfully operating DevSecOps and decentralizing security in an organization of that magnitude. So I'm going to try and weave into that. And yeah, and I guess kind of the last and maybe most important topic over here is I'd love to dig more into diversity. I think we're doing pretty miserable job at it as a community. I think the security community has improved, I think, as it embraces some DevOps style and culture, not just tooling and practices. It is becoming more inclusive, but we have to break the dam there. It's hard, like when there's so much talent shortage and it's so hard to hire, it's hard to also emphasize diversity as part of that. It's yet another very hard lift. I know we deal with it all the time at Sneak, but I think you have to keep trying. And so what I love to do is every now and then a guest shares some great practices about how they've tackled it. We've had, last year we had Tad talk about security, the day of security and the work they've done there. We had Tanya mention a bunch of things. This year Rinky had a great point around, growing the pool, not just sort of stealing security, diverse security candidates from different companies, moving them from one spot to the other, but how do we grow the pool? But I feel like this year I didn't have, there were also like Nitzan had some great ideas also last year in 2020, but I feel like this year I didn't have enough examples of some good tips on how to make our community more inclusive, have more diversity in it. And so I would definitely be looking for people that have good techniques to share, good approaches to share about how can we get this right.
Absolutely, a great mission. And Guy, I'm gonna sign off here with my last question, which is actually a question that you've asked many guests, pretty much all guests actually over the last almost year, which is the crystal ball question. So you always ask that tricky question saying, if you had a crystal ball, what would the world look like in 5 years in terms of I guess roles and activities and challenges and those kind of things to our guests? Well, Guy, we're not going to let you get off scot-free here. We're going to ask that same question to you. What do you think our environment, our world is going to look like, I guess, in our security world? It's going to look like in 5 years' time.
A taste of my own medicine is never it's never that hard. And it's not an easy question. And I think the fact that it's open-ended is the reason I ask it, because people take it in many, many different directions.
Because you've heard so many answers, we need a completely unique answer from you.
Yeah, I need those. Like I was about to say that I do agree with a lot of the comments that have been made around AI and around the developer engagement in it. There have been a lot of great answers to this. I think there are many changes, but I think one that hasn't been raised is going back to thinking about the application as a whole. So like as a single entity that has a lot of moving parts. I think what's been happening in the industry is that we've been because of the split into independent teams and because of all these kind of API-enabled interactions between them, we've gotten better at sort of automating and identifying all sorts of security mistakes in each one of these pieces, in each one of these components, whether they are different services or a specific library. And I think those are important, but they're overwhelming. And so I'm kind of imagining what I think there's going to be a bit of a wave where we're kind of approaching a certain breaking point in which it's just impossible to deal and fix all of these different local vulnerabilities. And we have to think in global terms. We have to think when I think about my application as a whole, when I think about my supply chain as a whole, how do I tackle that? How do I identify the security flaws that matter most? And so to an extent, what I think will happen in 5 years is that we will be in a place in which we have more of a taxonomy and a tooling set that talks about security at a slightly higher resolution or lower resolution. Is that a little bit less fine-grained, but that is effective and that is connected to the line of codes on those tactical practices. And I think we have to do that because otherwise it would just get very messy. But I'm seeing all sorts of good indications, and I think there will be positive progress there. So.
Yeah, and really, really positive ways for developers to have real impact with their security changes and remediations and things like that to make sure that that's really having an impact. So, Guy, we're pretty much there for the end of this episode, and I guess there for the end of the all episodes of 2021. Why don't you sign off for this episode and for 2021?
First of all, I just want to say a huge thank you. I mean, I'm grateful for all these great guests that come on the show and share their learnings and my, picky questions there and trying to learn from them. I'm very much thankful to all the listeners. Thank you all for being part of this community, for helping spread the knowledge. I'm seeing the further twists and mentions, and I think that's awesome. We want to level up together as a community, and I know there's a lot of great content out there, and I appreciate you sort of tuning into this one. I hope you keep finding it useful. The one ask that I have, you might think that podcasts are these like digital native type entities and that we're able to see, what people liked or didn't like, very, very easily, so we can learn from it and know what else you want us to be doing or how to correct, better serve all of you great listeners. It's not. Podcasts are actually fairly archaic in terms of the insight that we get, which makes us even more dependent on just your inputs to say, what did you like? What did you not like? Where did you stop listening? Which guests would you like to see? What are your topics, for 22 or themes on it? What are guests you'd love to see on? So those or any other commentary, would love to hear from you. You can send notes to tsd@snyk.io or the full-fledged the secure developer at snyk.io, or you can just tweet or DM either myself at GuyPod or us at the secure dev. And we really would love to hear from you. There's a million topics we can dig into, and would love to kind of make the most out of your time as we go into the new year. So thanks again. I hope you enjoyed all the opinions and the views that we got to share here over the course of the year, that you have an amazing break if you're managing to get one over the end of year celebrations. I'm looking forward to be back with a brand new array of smart guests in the new year.
Thanks for listening to The Secure Developer. That's all we have time for today. To find additional episodes and full transcriptions, visit thesecuredeveloper.com. If you'd like to be a guest on the show or get involved in the community, find us on Twitter at DevSecCon. Don't forget to leave us a review on iTunes if you enjoyed today's episode. Bye for now.